The restaurant looked like a place where only rich people belonged. Soft golden lights hung from the ceiling, reflecting off glass walls and polished floors. Everything inside felt expensive, from the neatly arranged tables to the quiet music playing in the background. Guests dressed in elegant clothes walked in slowly, talking in low voices, as if even their words had to match the luxury around them. Among all this, she moved quietly. She wore a simple uniform, clean but plain compared to the shining outfits around her. She carried trays, poured drinks, and nodded politely whenever someone called her. Most of the guests didn't even look at her face. To them, she was just part of the background, like the chairs or the walls. Still, she did her work carefully. If someone asked for water, she made sure the glass was filled just right. If a plate needed to be cleared, she picked it up without making noise. Her steps were light, almost unnoticeable. It was like she had learned how to exist without being seen. There were moments, though, when she slowed down. In one corner of the restaurant stood a grand piano. It was large and black, shining under a soft spotlight. Sometimes a professional pianist would sit there and play soft music that floated through the air like a gentle breeze. On those nights, she would steal quick glances while walking past. Not long looks, just small ones. But in those few seconds, something in her face would change. Her eyes would soften, and her steps would slow just a little, as if she wanted to stay there longer. Then, just as quickly, she would look away and continue working. Tonight was one of the busiest nights. The restaurant was hosting a special gathering. Important guests were expected, people who were used to the best things in life. The staff had been told to be extra careful, extra polite, and extra fast. Everything had to be perfect. She arrived early, tying her hair neatly and adjusting her uniform. The manager walked around giving instructions, reminding everyone not to make mistakes. There was a sense of pressure in the air, like something important was about to happen. She listened quietly and nodded. As the evening started, guests began to fill the room. Laughter mixed with the soft sound of glasses touching. Expensive perfumes filled the air. The piano sat ready in its place, waiting for the pianist who was supposed to arrive soon. She noticed it, as she always did. While carrying a tray, she passed by the piano and glanced at it for a second longer than usual. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray, as if remembering something. Then someone called her, and she turned away quickly. Her work didn't stop. Table after table, order after order, she kept moving. Some guests were kind and thanked her. Others barely spoke, simply pointing at what they wanted. A few even showed impatience, tapping their fingers on the table or sighing loudly if she took a few seconds too long. She didn't react. Her face stayed calm. She had learned long ago that reacting only made things harder. So she kept her head down and continued doing her job. But every now and then, her eyes would drift back to the piano. It wasn't just the piano itself. It was what it meant. Something about it pulled her attention again and again, like a quiet voice calling her from far away. At one point, she paused near a table close to it. No one noticed. The guests at the table were busy talking among themselves, laughing about something. She stood there for a second, holding an empty tray, and looked at the keys. Her fingers moved slightly in the air, almost without her realizing. It looked like she was pressing invisible keys. Then she stopped. She looked around quickly, as if afraid someone might have seen her. No one had. She took a small breath and walked away, returning to her work like nothing had happened. The evening continued to grow louder. More guests arrived, and the restaurant became full. The manager checked his watch again and again, clearly waiting for something. A few staff members whispered to each other, glancing toward the entrance. Something felt off. She noticed it too. While pouring water at a table, she heard two staff members talking quietly behind her. "The pianist still hasn't arrived," one of them said. "He's late?" the other asked. "Very late." She didn't turn around, but she listened. A small feeling stirred inside her, though she didn't fully understand it. She finished pouring the water and moved to the next table, but her thoughts stayed behind with those words. The pianist hasn't arrived. Her eyes slowly moved toward the piano again. It sat there, untouched. For the first time that evening, it didn't just look beautiful. It looked empty. She continued working, but something had changed. Her steps were still steady, her face still calm, but inside, a quiet tension began to grow. It was like something was waiting, something she couldn't name. The manager's voice grew sharper as time passed. He spoke to staff more quickly, giving shorter instructions. His eyes kept moving toward the entrance and then back to the piano. Guests were starting to notice the absence of music. The soft background sound that usually filled the room was missing. The silence felt heavier now. A few guests began to whisper. Some looked toward the piano, confused. Others simply continued their conversations. But the atmosphere was no longer as smooth as before. She felt it clearly. While carrying another tray, she passed by the piano again. This time, she didn't look at it for just a second. She looked a little longer. Her heart beat slightly faster, though she kept her expression the same. The polished surface reflected the lights above, and the keys waited silently, as if expecting someone. Her grip on the tray tightened again. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might stop completely, like she might do something different. But then someone called her name from across the room. She blinked, turned, and walked away. The moment passed. Still, something remained. The night was far from over, and the tension in the air was slowly building. Guests didn't know it yet, but something unexpected was about to happen. And she, the quiet waitress no one really noticed, was standing closer to that moment than anyone could imagine. The noise inside the restaurant kept rising, but something important was missing. It wasn't loud enough to feel chaotic, yet it no longer had that smooth, calm feeling it started with. People were still talking, glasses were still clinking, and servers were still moving from table to table, but the silence between those sounds had become noticeable. The piano still stood untouched. She noticed it again while placing a dish on a table near the center. A guest thanked her without really looking at her, and she gave a small nod before stepping back. As she turned, her eyes moved toward the corner almost on their own. Still empty. Her chest felt a little tight, though she didn't know why. Near the entrance, the manager was now speaking on the phone. His voice was low, but his face showed clear worry. He turned away from the guests, pacing slightly, trying to stay calm. A few staff members kept looking at him, waiting for some kind of signal. Something was definitely wrong now. She moved toward the service area, placing down her tray and picking up another order. Two waiters stood nearby, whispering again. "He's not coming," one of them said quietly. "What do you mean not coming?" the other asked. "He had an emergency. They just got the message." Her hands paused for a second while adjusting the glasses on her tray. Not coming. The words echoed softly in her mind. She picked up the tray and walked back into the main hall, but her thoughts were no longer fully on her work. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere more clearly now. The missing music wasn't just a small detail anymore. It was starting to affect everything. Guests were noticing. At one table, a man leaned back in his chair and looked toward the piano. "Isn't there supposed to be live music tonight?" he asked, his voice calm but slightly annoyed. Another guest at a different table whispered something similar. Small questions like these began to spread across the room, moving quietly but quickly. The manager ended his call and stood still for a moment. He closed his eyes briefly, then took a deep breath and straightened his posture. When he turned back toward the hall, his face carried a forced calm, but his eyes showed pressure. He walked quickly toward the staff. "Keep everything moving," he said in a low but firm voice. "No delays, no mistakes." "But the music," one waiter started to say. "I know." The manager cut him off gently but firmly. "Just focus on your work for now." She stood a few steps away, listening without making it obvious. Her fingers pressed lightly against the tray she was holding. "Focus on your work." She nodded slightly to herself and walked toward another table. But it was getting harder. As she served food and cleared plates, her attention kept slipping. Not in a way that caused mistakes, but enough that she had to remind herself again and again to stay present. Still, her eyes would return to the same spot. The piano. At one point, she passed very close to it. No one was standing nearby. The spotlight above it made the black surface shine softly. It looked almost like it was waiting. She slowed down. Just for a moment. Her reflection appeared faintly on its surface. She could see herself there. Simple uniform, tired eyes, quiet expression. It didn't match the beauty of the instrument in front of her. Or maybe it did in a different way. Her hand shifted slightly, as if it wanted to reach out. But she stopped herself. She took a small step back and continued walking. Behind her, a group of guests had started speaking louder than before. Their voices weren't angry, but there was clear dissatisfaction now. "This is not what we expected," one of them said. "We were told there would be live piano," another added. The words reached the manager quickly. He approached their table with a polite smile, apologizing and trying to calm them down. His voice remained respectful, but the pressure on him was clear to anyone paying attention. She watched this from a distance while pretending to adjust items on another table. Something inside her felt unsettled. It wasn't just about the music. It was about the feeling in the room. The way everything that was once smooth and perfect was slowly starting to crack. And all because one person didn't arrive. She moved toward the back again, placing down empty dishes. Her mind was louder now. She remembered small things. Not full memories, just pieces. The sound of keys being pressed. The feeling of sitting in front of a piano. The way music could fill a room without needing words. She closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again quickly. This wasn't the time. She picked up another tray and returned to the hall. The manager was now speaking with another staff member near the piano. They both looked at it, then at each other, as if trying to find a solution that didn't exist. "There's no backup?" the staff member asked quietly. The manager shook his head. "No one at this level. Not for tonight." Their voices were low, but she caught enough to understand. No one at this level. She looked at the piano again. Her steps slowed. For a moment, it felt like everything around her became distant. The voices, the movement, the noise, all of it faded slightly. There was only the piano, standing there in silence. And her, a strange thought crossed her mind. Came softly, almost like a whisper. Then it grew stronger. She tried to ignore it at first. She walked past the piano again, heading toward another table. But the thought stayed with her, following her step by step. Her heart began to beat faster. She placed the tray down carefully, making sure not to draw attention. The guest at the table didn't notice anything unusual. To them, she was still just the same quiet waitress doing her job. But inside, something was changing. She stepped back from the table and stood still for a second. Her eyes moved once more toward the piano. This time, she didn't look away quickly. The room around her felt heavy with expectation. Even though no one knew what was about to happen, the manager was still trying to manage the situation. Guests were still talking, some now clearly impatient. And the piano, still waiting. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides. The thought returned again, stronger than before. This time, she didn't push it away. Instead, she took a small breath. And for the first time that night, she didn't move right away. Something was building, slowly but surely, leading toward a moment that would change everything. She stood still for a moment longer than she should have. Around her, the restaurant continued moving, but it no longer felt the same. The voices, the footsteps, the soft clinking of plates, all of it felt distant, like it was happening far away. Her focus stayed on one thing, the piano. Her heart was beating faster now. She could feel it clearly in her chest, steady but strong, like it was trying to push her forward. The thought that had been quietly sitting in her mind was no longer soft. It was loud now. She turned her head slightly and looked toward the manager. He was still near the front, speaking to a group of guests, trying to calm them. His smile looked polite, but his eyes showed worry. Every few seconds, he glanced toward the piano and then back at the guests. He didn't have a solution. No one did. She swallowed slowly. Her hands felt a little cold, even though the room was warm. She wiped them lightly against her uniform, trying to steady herself. For a second, She almost walked away again, telling herself to forget it, to just keep working like always. That would have been easier, safer. But something inside her didn't let her move. Instead, she took a small step forward. Then another. Each step felt heavier than usual, like she was walking against something invisible. Her eyes stayed focused ahead, but her thoughts were racing. What if she made a mistake? What if someone stopped her? What if everyone laughed? She pushed those thoughts down. She had done that many times before in her life. Still, this felt different. As she moved closer to the front, she noticed a few staff members looking at her. Not because they understood what she was about to do, but because she was walking in a direction she normally didn't. Waitresses didn't walk toward the manager unless they were called. She kept going. When she finally reached him, she stopped a few steps away. He was still talking, so she waited. Her hands were now gently clasped together, fingers pressing lightly against each other. Her breathing slowed, but her heart didn't. After a few seconds, the manager turned slightly and noticed her standing there. At first, he looked confused, as if wondering why she had come forward. "Yes?" he asked quietly, stepping a little aside from the guests. His tone wasn't harsh, just busy. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. For a brief moment, doubt rushed back in. It told her to stop, to say something simple, to walk away before it was too late. But she didn't. She took a small breath. I can play," she said softly. The words were simple, but they felt heavy. The manager blinked, not fully understanding. "What?" She looked toward the piano for a second, then back at him. "I can play the piano," she repeated, a little clearer this time. For a second, he just stared at her. Not in a rude way, but in surprise. His eyes moved over her uniform, then back to her face, as if trying to match what she said with what he saw. "You?" he asked, not meaning to sound doubtful, but unable to hide it completely. She nodded slightly. There was no anger in her expression, no frustration, just quiet certainty. "I used to play," she added. The manager glanced toward the piano again, then back at the guests who were still waiting, still expecting something to happen. Time was moving quickly. He rubbed his forehead lightly, clearly thinking. This wasn't part of any plan. This wasn't something he had prepared for. Letting a waitress perform in front of such important guests. It sounded risky. Very risky. "What kind of playing?" he asked, his voice lower now. She hesitated for just a second. "Classical, and some others," she said. Her answer was simple, but there was something steady in her tone. The manager looked at her again, more carefully this time. He noticed the calm in her face, the way she wasn't rushing her words, the way her eyes didn't move away. She didn't look like someone guessing. She looked like someone remembering. Behind them, another guest raised their voice slightly. "Is there going to be music or not?" they asked, clearly losing patience. The pressure grew heavier. The manager exhaled slowly. He didn't have many choices left. He could keep apologizing, or he could try something unexpected. His eyes moved from the guests to the piano, and then back to her. "This is important," he said quietly. "These are not easy guests." "I understand," she replied. Her voice was still soft, but it didn't shake. Another second passed. Then he made a decision. "All right," he said, almost under his breath. "We don't have time." He straightened slightly and looked at her one more time. "Go." The word was simple, but it carried everything. For a split second, she just stood there. Then she nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. She turned before her courage could fade. The walk toward the piano felt longer than it actually was. Every step seemed louder now, even though she was still moving softly. A few guests noticed her, their eyes following her path with curiosity. A waitress walking toward the piano? That wasn't normal. Whispers began to spread. "Who is she? What is happening? She's staff, isn't she?" She could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't look at them. She kept her gaze forward, focused only on where she was going. Her heart was still racing, but now there was something else with it, a quiet strength. When she reached the piano, she stopped. For the first time that night, She stood right in front of it, with nothing in her hands, no tray, no plates, no task to hide behind. Just herself. The room slowly began to quiet down. Not completely, but enough for the change to be felt. She took a small breath. Her hand lifted slightly and touched the edge of the piano. The surface was smooth and cool under her fingers. That simple touch sent a feeling through her. Something familiar. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. She moved to the bench and sat down slowly. The soft murmur of the room continued, but it was fading now. More people were watching. More people were wondering. A few still looked doubtful. Others looked curious. She placed her hands gently above the keys. For a second they hovered there, still, waiting. Her fingers trembled just a little. She closed her eyes briefly. In that moment, everything else disappeared. The guests, the lights, the whispers, the pressure. All of it faded into silence. There was only her and the piano. Then, she opened her eyes and lowered her fingers toward the keys. Her fingers hovered just above the keys for a brief moment. The whole room seemed to hold its breath with her, even though most people didn't realize they were doing it. Conversations had already started to fade. Glasses were no longer being lifted as often. Even the soft background noise of the restaurant felt weaker now, like it was slowly stepping back. She looked down at the piano keys. Black and white. Simple. But to her, they didn't feel simple at all. They felt like something familiar calling her back after a very long time. Her shoulders moved slightly as she took a slow breath. Then she pressed the first note. It was soft at first. So soft that a few guests weren't even sure they heard anything. Some continued looking around, still confused, still talking quietly. But then the second note came, and the third, and slowly something began to change. The sound grew, not loud in a sudden way, but steady, like water filling a quiet space. Each note connected to the next with care, as if she was building something piece by piece. Within seconds, the atmosphere inside the restaurant shifted. People started to notice. One by one, conversations stopped. Forks paused halfway to plates. Heads slowly turned toward the piano. Even those who had been impatient moments ago now sat still, unsure of what they were hearing but unable to ignore it. She kept playing. Her posture was straight, but not stiff. Her hands moved with a calm confidence that didn't match her earlier nervousness. It was as if something inside her had changed the moment the music began. The notes were not just correct. They felt alive. A soft melody filled the space, warm and deep, touching every corner of the room. It didn't feel like background music anymore. It felt like the center of everything. A guest at a nearby table leaned forward slightly, eyebrows raised. "This is coming from her?" someone whispered. No one answered because everyone already knew. The waitress. The same quiet woman who had been walking silently between tables just minutes ago. Now she was the one holding the entire room still. The manager stood a few steps away, completely frozen. His expression had changed from stress to disbelief. He had not expected this. Not even close. His eyes stayed on her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, controlled, precise. Another guest slowly lowered their glass without drinking. Their eyes were fixed on her, as if afraid to miss even a second. The music was now clearer, stronger, flowing through the space like a gentle wave. She continued playing, and with every passing moment, the piece grew more emotional. There was something in it that people couldn't explain. It wasn't just skill. It wasn't just practice. It felt personal, like every note had a memory behind it. Somewhere in the room, an older guest quietly closed their eyes. Their expressions softened, as if the music had taken them somewhere else entirely. Another guest, who had earlier complained about the missing pianist, now sat completely silent, their earlier frustration forgotten. The restaurant that once felt like a busy, noisy place had transformed into something else. A listening space, a shared moment, and she was at the center of it. Her fingers moved faster now, but not in a rushed way. The melody shifted, becoming slightly more complex. There were soft rises and gentle falls, like breathing, like emotions being translated into sound. Her face showed focus, but also something deeper. It wasn't just performance. It was expression. At one point, her left hand carried a low, deep rhythm while her right hand danced lightly across higher notes. The combination filled the room in a way that made people feel like they were inside the music instead of just hearing it. A few guests exchanged looks of disbelief. This was not what they expected from a waitress. Not at all. The manager finally took a step back, still unable to speak. He looked around the room and saw something he hadn't seen before in this place. Stillness. Complete attention. Even the staff who had been rushing earlier were now standing quietly at the edges, watching. No one was moving unnecessarily. The music had taken control of the room without force. It simply demanded attention. She kept going. Her expression remained calm, but inside, something was flowing freely now. The fear she had felt earlier was gone. The hesitation was gone too. All that remained was the sound under her fingers. Each note felt like it belonged, like it had always been waiting for her to play it. A few guests began to feel something unexpected. Emotion. Not loud or dramatic, but subtle. A tightness in the chest. A memory from long ago. A feeling they couldn't easily describe. The music wasn't just entertaining them. It was reaching them. One guest quietly placed a hand over their heart, surprised by their own reaction. Another blinked several times, trying to understand why they suddenly felt moved. The melody shifted again. Softer now. Slower. Almost like a gentle conversation. She leaned slightly into the piano, her hands moving with even more control. It was clear now that she wasn't just playing notes. She was shaping them. The room felt smaller somehow, more connected. Even people who had never cared for piano music before found themselves listening carefully, unable to look away. The earlier noise of the restaurant had completely faded now. There was only her music, and the silence around it. At one point, she paused for a fraction of a second between phrases. That tiny pause created a tension in the room, like everyone was waiting for what would come next. Then she continued, and the melody rose again, even more powerful than before. A soft wave of admiration spread through the guests. Some leaned back in their chairs, shaking their heads slightly, as if still trying to process what they were witnessing. The waitress was not invisible anymore. She was the focus. Every eye in the room was now on her, and she didn't look away even once. Her confidence had grown with each note, not in a loud or proud way, but in a quiet, steady way. The kind of confidence that comes from remembering something deeply familiar. The music continued to flow, filling the space completely. And in that moment, no one in the restaurant was just a guest anymore. They were all listeners, held together by a performance no one saw coming. The final notes still lingered in the air, slowly fading like a soft echo that didn't want to leave. For a moment, the room stayed completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if everyone needed a few extra seconds to understand what had just happened. Then reality slowly started to return. A few guests blinked, almost like waking up from a dream. One person quietly adjusted their posture, while another placed their hands back on the table, still looking toward the piano with disbelief. The silence that followed the music felt heavier than the music itself. She sat at the piano, hands resting gently on her lap now. Her breathing was steady, but her heart was still carrying the emotion of what she had just played. She didn't look around immediately. Felt like she needed a moment to come back to the present. The manager finally moved. He stepped forward slowly, still processing what he had witnessed. His expression was no longer stressed or worried. It had completely changed. There was shock, yes, but also something deeper. Admiration mixed with confusion. He stopped a few steps away from her. For a second, he didn't speak. Neither did she. Then he quietly said, That was not expected." She lifted her eyes slightly, still calm. "I'm sorry if I caused any trouble," she said softly. The manager quickly shook his head. "No," he replied. "No, you didn't cause trouble. You solved one." His words were simple, but they carried meaning. He looked around the room. The guests were still watching, some whispering among themselves, others still silent. The atmosphere had completely shifted. The earlier tension, frustration, and impatience had disappeared. It had been replaced by something far more powerful, respect. At one table, a guest leaned toward another and said quietly, "I've never heard anything like that here." Another guest nodded slowly. "Neither have I." Near the piano, she slowly stood up. Her hands moved slightly, as if unsure what to do next. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to return to her normal duties, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The manager noticed it too. He stepped closer and spoke in a lower voice, so only she could hear. "Where did you learn to play like that?" She hesitated. It wasn't a question she was used to answering. Her eyes moved briefly toward the piano before returning to him. "I used to play, a long time ago," she said. The manager studied her face carefully, as if trying to understand the full story just from her expression. "Professionally?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. That small pause said enough. He nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were starting to form in his mind. Behind them, the guests were still reacting quietly. Some were praising the performance. Others were trying to explain to each other what they had just felt, though words didn't seem enough. A few staff members gathered near the edge of the room, still stunned. One of them whispered, "We never knew she could do that." Another replied, "None of us did." She heard it but didn't react. Instead, she looked down at her hands again. They felt the same as before. Nothing about them had changed. But everything they had just done felt far away, almost unreal. The manager gestured slightly toward the room. "You should know," he said carefully. "They're impressed. Very impressed." She gave a small nod, not fully sure how to respond to that. In her world, she was used to being noticed only when something went wrong, not when something went right. But tonight was different. The guests were still watching her. Some were even smiling now. A few nodded toward her in silent appreciation. It wasn't loud praise, but it was real. The manager took a breath. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked up. He continued, "Why didn't you say anything before?" There was no blame in his voice, only curiosity. She looked toward the piano again before answering. "I didn't think it mattered," she said simply. That answer made him pause. He looked at her more carefully now. Really looked at her. Not as a waitress, but as someone he clearly hadn't understood at all. "You were right," he said quietly. "It mattered." A soft silence followed. The room was still filled with guests, but the focus was no longer on the event. It was on her. She shifted slightly, feeling the weight of attention. It was unfamiliar and maybe a little uncomfortable, but not frightening. Just new. A guest at a nearby table raised their hand slightly, calling the manager over. He excused himself and walked away, leaving her alone near the piano. For the first time since sitting down, she finally looked around properly. The faces she saw were different now. Earlier, they had been impatient, distracted, or indifferent. Now they were attentive, curious, even respectful. She wasn't invisible anymore. That realization settled quietly inside her. She turned slightly toward the piano again. It looked the same as before, but now it felt different. It wasn't just an object in the corner anymore. It had become the center of something unexpected. Her fingers moved lightly over the edge of the bench. A staff member approached slowly and spoke in a low voice. "You can rest if you want," they said. "We'll take care of the rest." She nodded gently, but she didn't move right away. Her eyes stayed on the piano for a few more seconds. Inside her, something was shifting. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet realization that had been buried for a long time. She had done something tonight that she thought belonged to her past. Something she had never expected to share again. And yet, it had just filled an entire room. The manager returned after a moment, speaking briefly with the guests, still receiving reactions of praise and surprise. A few of them were even asking questions about her, trying to understand who she was. But she wasn't used to being discussed like that. She quietly stepped back, trying to return to her usual space. Still, the feeling of the moment stayed with her. The music she had played was no longer just sound in the air. It had become a memory for everyone in that room. And for her, it had become something even more important. A reminder that something she thought was lost might not be lost at all. She took a slow breath and finally turned away from the piano. But even as she walked, she could still feel its presence behind her. She walked slowly away from the piano, but it still stayed with her in a strange way. The sound was gone, yet it felt like it was still inside the room, inside the walls, and even inside her own thoughts. The restaurant had started to return to its normal rhythm, but nothing felt truly normal anymore. Guests were still talking about what they had just witnessed. Some were smiling while explaining it to others. Some were still quiet, as if they needed more time to understand it fully. A few even looked toward her as she moved between tables. But this time their eyes were different. There was no indifference anymore. Now there was recognition. She tried to return to her work, picking up trays and clearing tables like before, but something had changed in the way she moved. She was still careful and quiet, but now she felt seen. Even when no one spoke to her directly, she could feel the attention following her in a softer way. At one table, a guest stopped her gently. "That was you, right?" the guest asked. She paused for a moment, then gave a small nod. The guest smiled. "It was beautiful. I've never heard anything like that in a place like this." She lowered her eyes slightly, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said softly, then continued her work. But the words stayed with her. Beautiful. It was not something she heard often, not in that way. Across the room, the manager was still speaking with guests. He was answering questions, accepting compliments, and trying to manage the sudden attention the restaurant was now receiving. A few guests were even requesting to know more about her, asking if she performed regularly. The manager didn't have clear answers yet. He kept glancing toward her as she worked quietly, as if trying to understand how he had never noticed this side of her before. After some time, the crowd began to settle again. The energy of the room softened. Dinner continued, but the atmosphere had completely transformed from what it was at the beginning of the night. There was now a calm respect in the air. She moved toward the service counter to place empty dishes down. For a moment, she stopped and stood still. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the counter. Her mind felt full, but not in a confusing way. It was more like everything was slowly settling into place. The piano performance replayed in her thoughts again and again, not as noise, but as feeling. Each note she had played seemed to come back gently, reminding her of something she had not allowed herself to think about for a long time. One of the senior staff members approached her quietly. "You did something very special tonight," they said. She looked up slightly. "I just played," she replied simply. The staff member shook their head. It wasn't just playing. She didn't answer that. Instead, she gave a small, polite nod and returned to her tasks. But deep inside, something was beginning to shift. Not loudly, not suddenly, but slowly, like a door that had been closed for years finally cracking open. Later, as the evening began to wind down, the restaurant grew quieter. Guests started leaving one by one. Some gave final compliments as they passed. Others simply smiled in her direction before walking out. Each small gesture added something to her thoughts. She had spent so long being invisible that even simple acknowledgement felt unfamiliar. When the last few tables were being cleared, the manager finally approached her again. This time he didn't look stressed. His expression was calm, but thoughtful. He stood near her for a moment before speaking. "We need to talk," he said. She nodded slightly and followed him to a quieter corner of the restaurant. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "Tonight changed things here." She listened quietly. He continued, "People will remember what happened. Some of them will come back just because of that performance." She looked down slightly, unsure what to say. The manager added, "But more importantly, I need to understand what you want." That question made her pause. No one had asked her that directly before. "What I want," she repeated softly. He nodded. "Yes, do you want to continue like this? Or Is there something else you want for yourself? She looked toward the piano, which was now being cleaned and prepared to be closed for the night. It stood there quietly again, no longer the center of attention, but still holding the memory of what had happened. Her eyes stayed on it for a long moment. She thought about everything, the years of silence, the moments of hiding something she once loved, the feeling she had when her fingers touched the keys again, the way the room had changed when the music began. And then she realized something simple but important. She had not felt invisible when she was playing. After a pause, she spoke softly. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I don't want to forget tonight. The manager nodded slowly. He seemed to understand more than he said. That's enough for now, he replied. The conversation ended there, but the meaning of it stayed. She returned to her duties for the final cleanup, but her mind was no longer only on work. It was on possibilities, on thoughts she had not allowed herself before. When everything was finally finished and the restaurant became quiet, she stood near the exit for a moment. The night air outside felt different as she stepped out. Cooler, calmer, more open. She paused just outside the door and looked back one last time. Inside, the piano was still visible in the distance. For a brief moment, she didn't feel like a waitress. And she didn't feel like a performer either. She just felt like someone standing at the edge of a new path. A path she had not chosen yet, but now knew existed. Then she turned away and walked into the quiet night, carrying something new with her that she didn't have before. A beginning,